Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this first of a two-part series on issues related to the Gaza war. Today, we are really privileged to have a wonderful speaker, an old friend, and an expert who we said literally just wrote a book on this topic of Jewish war ethics called Ethics of Our Fighters. I don't know how good the book is, but the title is fantastic. I'm sure the book is fantastic too. I just read an essay by Rabbi Brody in Sapir about how to deal with this current conflict. Just a few bio notes. Rabbi Brody is the executive director of Ematai and the Jewish Law Live columnist for the Jerusalem Post. Ematai is an organization that has been reformulated, used to be known as the Halakhic Organ Donor Society. Now, in its reformulation, it deals with all sorts of end-of-life issues, not only halakhic organ donation, and helps guide families and individuals through conversations and decision-making processes as loved ones enter into that end-of-life stage. It's a really great and very, very important resource in the Jewish community, and it's wonderful that you are heading it up, Rabbi Brody. Before this position, Rabbi Brody was the founding director of the Tikva Overseas Student Institute and the co-dean of the Tikva Online Academy. Many of our kids currently are involved in Tikva programming, and we're involved in Tikva programming. When I say our, I mean my personal biological children and our children, our community children as well. He also is a senior instructor at Yeshivat HaKotel and a research fellow at the Israel Democracy Institute. Today's topic is about siege warfare and the ethics and halakhic behind the questions of siege warfare. Rabbi Brody is going to speak for about 30 minutes, and then it will be open to questions and discussions. Once again, everyone is welcome to put their camera on if they'd like to, but don't have to. I'll remind everyone that next week on Tuesday night is going to be Matt Levitt on the war that Hamas wanted. He literally wrote a book on Hamas and Hezbollah, and so he is an expert of a different element of this conflict. Okay, with that introduction, and again, gratitude to you, Rabbi Brody, for joining us. Thank you. I turn it over to you.
Okay, Rabbi Gelman, thank you so much. It's wonderful to see you, old friendships, and really wonderful to see wonderful work in Denver. This is a bit of a surreal time, as I was mentioning to Rabbi Gelman beforehand. I'm here in Modi'in. I have in Israel. I always have to mention, although we haven't thankfully had this issue too much recently, but if there's a siren in the middle of this year, you'll have to bear with me while I reorient to the bomb shelter. But which is something which I think Jews get right now. I've had some meetings actually with organization people and other people, and they're like, wait a minute, you're in Israel? Like, this is like, they're a little bit shocked always when I mention this. And it is a bit of a surreal time. And I think precisely because it's such a surreal period, it's important to strengthen our moral fortitude and strengthen understanding of some of the issues that are coming up right now. I want to say from the get-go, I'm not here to do hasbara, meaning I think hasbara is a fine thing, but then I'm happy to discuss some of the issues as it applies, of course, as we'll discuss to the current war in Gaza. But what I want to try to mostly work on right now is to tease out some of the ideas of Jewish military ethics and how it might be relevant to our current situation. As Rabbi Gelman mentioned, I sort of, once again, in a surreal way, have a book that's being printed now that I've been working on for quite some time on Jewish military ethics. And when I started working on it, so some of my friends, including people who care a lot about Judaism and Jewish sources and all this, would crack jokes. Oh, you're writing about Jewish military ethics. That's going to be a very short book. And the argument more or less went along the lines that, well, what do we have to say about military ethics. After all, we didn't have so much military involvement for many, many centuries. And of course, that's true. But what I found, and I think you'll see once the book comes out, please God, is that there's actually quite a lot to say about it. And the topics we're going to be focusing on today with regard to siege warfare is really, in many ways, the type of war that existed throughout the centuries. That's one of the most ancient techniques of war. And as I'm going to try to argue today, had a big impact in the way we think about civilian casualties. Um, One of the things that we always have to think about when it comes to Judaism and war is we have on the one hand, we have our sources, we have our texts, which are usually the precedents that we look for when it comes to issues of halacha or ethics, whatever it might be. But one of the questions I want to ask from the get-go is, how does Jewish experience, the historical experience, and particularly be subjugated to the horrors of war, how might that impact us when we think about the ethics of how we'll fight war today, given what we've experienced in the past? And I think that's a open and live question about many things, and it's certainly going to be a question which I'm going to bring up in our context today as well. So it's let's get started. And then, as Rabbi Gelman said, I'll speak for a little bit now and try to present a bit, but feel free to already start sending questions in the chat, which I'm going to try to ignore as much as possible at this point, unless there's something that needs to be clarified. Rabbi Gelman, feel free to jump in if that's the case, and then we'll continue on with conversation and questions as we move forward. Okay, so I want to start here with an important event. This is July 1982. Israel has begun Operation for the Peace of Galilee, which will later be known as the Lebanon War, which will then even later be known as the First Lebanon War. And this is a big war when it comes to questions of Jewish military ethics and Israeli military ethics, because until now, until 82, certainly in the wars of 56 and 67 and 73, by and large, the biggest ethical questions coming up are when to go to war, because you have all sorts of questions about what justifies war, preemptive war, preventative war, being a self-defense war. Those are the major issues. And the questions about how to fight ethically within war. Really, there are issues, of course, that come up in those earlier wars, no doubt. But the 82 war, the Lebanon War, changes things because Israel is now entering urban warfare. The battlefields are not clearly demarcated. You're entering into urban areas, or I won't say urban, but civilian areas, and fighting asymmetric warfare, because here the fight is not against the Egyptian army or the Syrian army, but rather the PLO, which, having been kicked out of Jordan, is now operating out of Lebanon and southern Lebanon. This is before Hezbollah. I'm sure Matt Lev will discuss this, right? But this is well before Hezbollah is there. And the PLO, led by Yasser Arafat, has been terrorizing Israel for several years already from southern Lebanon. And Israel decides to go in. Now, we're not getting to why they go into Lebanon, how that was decided, but whatever it is, a month into the war, Israel slowly made its way up to Beirut, the capital, and lays a siege on Beirut. Now, this is a real siege. What I mean by that is the current quote-unquote siege on Gaza isn't really a siege, at least not by Israel. For one side, one border isn't controlled by Israel, it's controlled by Egypt. And despite the initial claims by the defense minister, which was probably a mistake, but Israel hasn't really put on, it certainly hasn't been a large blockade, but not a full siege. Whereas in the case in Beirut, Israel is actually circling the city, where Arafat and 14,000 of his men were held up and fighting from. And when the Israeli IDF has laid a siege on Beirut, the man on the bottom right, Rabbi Shlomo Brody, who's then the Ashkenazic chief rabbi of the whole state, but is most famous for being the chief rabbi of the IDF. He blows the shofar very famously at the Western Wall. So Rabbi Brody drops his own bombshell, if you will, and says the IDF is obligated, according to Jewish ethics, to leave open one side of the siege. That means to say, you cannot have a hermetically sealed siege around Beirut. You have to leave open one side to allow people to flee. Now, he means it's sort of a one-way, if you will, evacuation corridor, the way we frame it today, meaning he doesn't think you have to let supplies, weapons in, but you have to allow people to get out. And this is a requirement of Jewish law. And given the fact that he's known as quite a militant figure, right? I mean, chief rabbi of the IDF for so long, and with hawkish views, and B, that he's an Ashkenazi chief rabbi, it creates a bit of a stir, right? That he makes this declaration. And the man on top, Rabbi Shaul Yisraeli, who's the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Merkaz Harav, comes out against Rav Goren and says this is crazy. There's no such obligation, certainly not in what we know as a Milchemet Mitzvah, a war of self-defense, which both of them felt it was. And there's certainly no obligation. You don't fight wars this way. Right? You don't fight wars this way. When you lay a siege, we all know what a siege is. Siege is the classic method. You got to circle the entire thing. This makes no sense. Indeed, this machloket, by the way, if you look at my friend Chaim Seiman's book on halacha, so Rabbi Dr. Seiman there cites Rabbi Goren's position as one of these crazy, theoretical, totally implausible positions of halacha. So we'll come back to this, what happened afterwards. But for now, I want you to understand this statement. Where does this come from, Rav Goren, and what might this say? Okay? And what I want to try to do before we get back to this story is to lay out a little bit of some of what I think are principles of Jewish military ethics. Because what Rabbi Goren is getting at here seems to be some idea of saying, well, there's an element of humanitarianism that has to emerge. And what Rabbi Yisraeli is saying, what are you talking about? The purpose of war is to win the war, right? The purpose of war is to be decisive. The purpose of war is to destroy the enemy, to conquer the territory, whatever the aim might be. How can you introduce this? And I think one of the things I'm going to try to pose it right now, but of course I try to develop a lot, but I think intuitively we'll understand today. Jewish military ethics is built around several different principles. And the question that's always going to come is, how do you balance those principles in a given situation, right? How do you determine how to apply one or the other in a given situation? I think this is true about Jewish ethics. In general, we have certain principles, and it's always going to be the case we're going to be balancing, or we're trying to figure out which principle applies in a case. It could be medical ethics, right, which is what I deal with in Ematai. It could be a lot of other areas, but Jewish ethics are going to be about holding together and trying to figure out what applies different values. And in the case of military ethics, I posed that we have 9 different principles that we have to keep in mind. And I think all these principles, you might agree are correct, and the question becomes, but they may not always agree with each other. So let's start from the get-go. There's the notion of dignity of mankind, that all human beings were created in the image of God. This is an important part to always keep in mind. By the way, for this reason, I don't like it when people refer to Hamas as animals, or Hamas members as animals, and certainly others. It might be horrific what they did. I fully agree with that, and immoral and all sorts of things. I think it's a bad idea to refer to enemy people, doesn't matter who they are, how horrible they are, as animals. Right? All human beings are created in the image of God, and it's always important to keep that in mind, and which is related to the next point, namely that in general, there's a real wrong of illicit, right, inappropriate bloodshed based on this idea of the dignity of mankind. Another principle, which I think want to pose it out there, which I think we'll all understand, is that in general, we have a belief that human beings are responsible for their actions, and that's whoever sins are the ones that should be punished, but it doesn't mean we want to punish others as well. There's a notion of individual responsibility. And there's another vision, which I think is important to keep in mind. I think it's particularly important to keep in mind when you're in the midst of war, which is to remember that Judaism has a notion of world peace. I actually get a lot of strength from this idea right now, because when you're in the midst of a terrible war, and you're in the midst of a war against, I consider to be a horrific enemy in a lot of different ways, it's important to hold out hope for a better future. I think it's a very important thing to always keep in mind. And in this respect, we should take inspiration, I think, from some of our visions, which include, of course, this is a picture of the UN wall, or the Isaiah wall, excuse me, at the UN, in which we bring the psukim, that's both in Yeshayahu and Micha. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. This is a very powerful idea. We should always keep this in mind. However, if you look at the parallel from Yeshayahu, maybe this is why they picked the verses at the Isaiah wall from Yeshayahu and not in Micha. If you look in the parallel where it is also quoted in Micha, 8 psukim later, we read the following: "For I will give you horns of iron and provide you with the hooves of brawn, and you will crush the many people." That is to say, it seems to be acknowledged on the one hand, our aspiration is the cessation of warfare, but we understand, Micha understands, the reality is that warfare is sometimes necessary in order to bring justice into this world. And now, this is a painful fact, but a reality that to defend oneself, to settle the homeland, and to rid the world of evil, warfare is necessary. And unfortunately, or for better or for worse, the nature of warfare is that it's collective. These aren't individuals fighting against each other, right? But you're talking about nations, and that's part of the reality of how war is, and you can't ignore that reality, nor can you ignore the fact that when you're in war, you're going to be partial to your own people. That's why we go to war, right? To protect ourselves and to protect our people and protect our soldiers. And there's a national partiality which comes with that, including the encouragement of chazak ve'ematz, to be brave and courageous, right? That there's a notion of fighting is a virtue. Being brave is virtuous here. And here I'll add one other factor, which I think is important to keep in mind, but it goes a lot of different ways, which is that when you fight wars, there's a notion of national honor. We call this Kiddush Hashem or Chilul Hashem, okay? But national honor can go a lot of different ways. And on the one hand, there's a concern that we don't disgrace ourselves, right? Or we act appropriately, which is a tribute to our reputation, it's a tribute to our honor. But there's also an element, which has been a massive Chilul Hashem for many centuries, of Jewish subjugation, that is a problem. That itself is a Chilul Hashem. And I think that what shocks so many people about 10/7, if you will, is the fact that suddenly what happened, right, to the great mighty Jewish people? Why are we going back to feeling like we're back to pogroms and the Holocaust? And so what I want to argue with you, right, argue to you and pose it, is that all of these values I sort of try to lay out here, I think people can understand intuitively. There's a lot of logic to these values. And then the question is going to become, well, how do you balance these values? Because they don't always necessarily go together. And that's going to be one of the questions which are going to come up. And I want to see a little bit more where these values might be developed from. So if you look, we read this a couple of weeks ago in the Parsha with the story of Lot. There seems to be an understanding from the get-go that Jews are going to fight for the land of Israel. This is a theme that's emphasized by the Ramban. It's emphasized by others as well. This notion of saying that sometimes going to war is going to be necessary. And as I mentioned beforehand, we do seem to stress greatly this notion of courage, right? That we tell all the warriors in Devarim and Perek Chaf about not letting your courage falter. And let's also keep in mind that biblical warfare, and this is what I was trying to get at earlier, seems to be quite bloody. Okay, I remember the first time I actually had Rabbi Gel made a reference to Tikva, my work in Tikva. So I once invited one of Israel's most distinguished military ethicists to speak to a group of Tikva students, and he spoke for about 45 minutes. And then the first question, one of the girls from one of the midrashot says, "Well, what does Judaism have to say about this?" And the military ethicist, who knows something about Jewish sources, Saba Shelo Hayarav, his grandfather was a quite prominent rabbi, in fact. And the ethicist says, the only thing that Judaism has to contribute to military ethics is Amalek and Eshet Yafat Toar. Leave that out. And that was sort of, and as you can imagine, that led to a whole brouhaha within the classroom. But you understand, right, that there is something to keep in mind. And here you have the legacy of the Battle of Amalek. Now, I don't think anyone here wants to fight like Amalek, and Amalek doesn't exist anymore. It's sort of a share in its own right. But there is a clear principle that we see in the story of Amalek, in which there's an idea which says that there's evil in the world, and this evil should be rooted out of the world. Okay, and so if you go back to some of the principles here,
to a talk.
and so if you go back to some of the principles here, you'll see that that we're trying to balance a bit of these ideas. And in particular, I want to share a story which we'll come back to in Bamidbar Lamed Aleph. This is the story of the war against Midian. And you'll recall that here they go out and they kill all of the male fighters, Kol Zachar. They go out and kill all the male fighters. They come back to Moshe and show all the women and children taken captive and all the booty. And what does Moshe tell them? Kill the women as well and all the male children as well. And so whatever you want to think about that story, I think it's actually probably the most brutal story of warfare in the Torah. You have here a situation where seems to be one of the messages, and we're going to come back to dealing with the legacy of this story. So part of what I want to argue here, though, is that the notion of warfare is accepted with equanimity in the Torah, and there's a notion of importance of bravery, a notion that we use warfare to root out evil, and this goes together with, at the same time, the belief in the dignity of mankind, the notion of not illicitly killing people, and their vision of world peace. How does this all work together? And here, I think we enter into the one area where the Torah is pretty explicit about some form of limitations. It's probably the only pasuk in the Torah where we see limitations of warfare, and it's precisely in the context of a siege. And this is important to keep in mind because siege warfare is clearly being used. It's being used by Yoshua, Chazak ve'amatz, he's told. It's used in a number of different cities when he attacks, right, the land of Canaan, Eretz Yisrael. But we are told in Devarim the following: when you are in war against a city and you have to besiege it a long time in order to capture it, you must not destroy its trees. And this is probably the most explicit, maybe even the only limitation on warfare that we see explicitly in the Torah, this idea of not destroying the trees, right? You may eat of them, but you shouldn't cut them down. Adam etz hasadeh, right? There's different ways of translating this, but are trees of the field human to withdraw before you into the besieged city? That is to say, they've got nowhere to go. So have mercy on the trees. And this is, pasuk is used as sort of the origin for a lot of different laws, but including the notion of Baal Tashchit. And this is where we get it from. But primarily at its core, this is not about being careful of the environment, not being destructive of things. This is about not having a situation where you utterly destroy a city. And instead, make sure you leave the world habitable afterwards, right? Scorched earth policies is something which should be not applied. But it's not a surprise that this is about a siege, because sieges are the known method of warfare, and sieges are the method of warfare that Jews use in the times of Tanakh as well. But not only do we use it, we also suffer from it. Okay? And here I want to show two passages, one from Bayit Rishon, one from Bayit Sheni, First Temple, Second Temple, and where you see how Jews suffer under sieges. Okay? We're familiar with this on Tisha B'Av when we read Eicha, but it's worthwhile to focus a bit on the language here for a moment, and I've picked the language of the fourth parak of Eicha. We're told this in Malachim Bet, we're told this in other places in Divrei Yamim as well, that Jews suffered from starvation in the times of the temple's destruction. But take a look at the description here in Eicha of how we suffered under sieges. The gold is dulled, right? Everyone's debased. The poor people have turned cruel. Everyone is searching, right, for food. They don't find it. Little children beg for bread. No one gives them a morsel. Those who had previously had dainties right now lie famished in the streets. Those who were reared in purple and glorious clothing have embraced refuse heaps, right? They're in the garbages. the guilt, etc. He talks about their faces now are blacker than soot. People are unrecognizable. Their body has changed so much from the hunger. Their skin has shriveled on their bones and has become dry as wood. Better off were the slain of the sword than those slain by famine, meaning it was better for people to have been killed earlier by the sword than to wither away and die through famine. And here you get to the terrible description of women killing their own children and eating their flesh. And this is the way we are told that Korban by Rishon happens. Okay? Humans are literally, mothers are literally killing their children. And according to Josephus, we have the same idea as well in the Second Temple period. And here I want to stress the following because there's always this interesting question. If you've gone and offered peace and the other side says no, do you have any ethical responsibility at that point to care for the harm to the people on the other side, on the enemy's side? This is a major question when it comes to military ethics in general. And here is a very interesting phenomenon which Josephus brings to the table. He tells the story of, once again, the hunger that goes on during Bayit Sheni. And by the way, I want to point out, we have a fast day on a Jewish calendar, which we still observe today, which is all about the suffering that happens from sieges. And that is called Asara B'Tevet, the 10th of Tevet, right? It's a really remarkable day. If you think about it, what is the point? We have a fast day about the breaking of the walls. We have a fast day about the Chorban itself, the destruction of the temple. And now we have a fast day about the siege. The siege itself, right, is so significant. And the answer is yes, because the siege causes horrific suffering for those 2.5 years. And in the time of Korban Sheni, we have this as well. And they have the same types of stories of women eating their children and cutting them up and cannibalism, really terrific. And the Romans who are laying siege on the city, according to Josephus, hear about these stories. And this sad instance was told to the Romans, some of whom could not believe it. And others pity the distress which the Jews were under, meaning some of the soldiers feel really bad, but there are many of them who are hereby induced to more bitter hatred, and they're like, they just hate the Jews, they don't really care. And then they went to Caesar and said to Caesar, is this, don't you feel bad about this? And Caesar says as follows, I propose peace and liberty to the Jews, meaning I told them, surrender, right? And you can stay alive. But they, instead of concord, chose sedition. Instead of peace, war. Instead of satiety and abundance, a famine. Meaning, what is Caesar's claim? I don't bear responsibility for the suffering on the other side once the war begins, because I offer them a way out. They could have surrendered. And once they don't surrender, right, that's their fault. And therefore, I don't have to feel bad about the starvation going on the other side. So sieges are a prominent part of our historical legacy. We have in Bayit Rishon, we have in Bayit Sheni, and by the way, the story of Beitar, of the Bar Kokhba rebellion, also ends with a siege around the city and in terrible suffering and bloodshed. Jews know what sieges are about and what they can inflict on us. And here we get to, I think, what I want to try to introduce right now about sieges and what it tells us about Jewish perspectives on the ethics of warfare. Because I mentioned earlier, there's one really explicit statement related to sieges, right, about some form of limitations on war. But we also have a statement in the same parak in which it discusses that when you approach a town, you shall offer peace. Now, interestingly enough, this is both in a milchemet mitzvah and a milchemet reshut, according to Rambam, meaning it's not just we offer peace when we go out for expansionary war. I don't want to get this into right now, but it is also in cases in which we are fighting wars of self-defense or conquering the land, and even there too as well. Even the times of Yoshua, we had to offer peace to these cities. Where does this idea come from? How do we know this is true? And the Medrash tells us a really wild story of a conversation between Moshe and God. And Moshe is told by God, utterly destroy them, lo techanem, I have no mercy on them. And Moshe says back to him, wait a minute, How can I go and kill all these people? I do not know who has sinned and who has not sinned. Meaning, what exactly is Moshe saying to God? Moshe is saying to him, I'm not going to just go fight a war and kill everyone. I don't want to do that because not all these people have sinned. They haven't harmed against me. They haven't done anything. Why should I go and kill everyone when I don't know if these are people that have sinned? So instead, I'm going to offer peace because I'd rather offer peace, right? Maybe they'll be subjugated to us, but I'd rather offer peace than have it to do kill people who have not sinned. And Moshe gets a reply from God where God says to him, I've agreed. I agree. What you said, so will I do. When you draw near to a city, you shall offer terms of peace to it. Okay? So this is a very interesting statement because it's not just that we try to avoid war, that war is a last resort, but the rationale of it that's given by the Medrash is to say that it's because we don't want to kill those who haven't sinned. And here you get to what the most fascinating novel law in all of, I think, Jewish statements about military ethics, classic sources, in which we're told the following in the Medrash, in the Sifri. They warred against Midian. Let's remember the story we're talking about here. Remember this story? The passage in the Torah, which is so bloody about the war against Midian. So from here, Chazal bring down the following drasha. And they say when they warred against Midian, they surrounded it from four sides. Okay, well, how do Chazal know they surrounded it from four sides? Because that's how you lay a siege. But Rabbi Natan, 2nd century CE, comes and says as follows. They left the fourth side for them to flee from. Now, again, friends, this was a very bloody war. Where does Rabbi Natan know this from? It's clearly not from Pshat. It's clearly not from the simple meaning of the text. But Rabbi Natan says you leave a fourth side open for them. And interestingly enough, both the Rambam, Maimonides, and the Ramban, Nachmanides, agree with Rabbi Natan. So look at the Rambam's formulation. When a siege is placed around a city to conquer it, it should not be surrounded on all four sides, only on three. When you lay a siege, you cannot, to conquer it, only lay it on three. A place should be left for the inhabitants to flee and for all those who desire to escape with their lives, as it is written in Numbers 31, the story in Bamidbar. Now, of course, we saw it's not really written there at all. And so the Rambam says, how do I know this is true? According to tradition, Mepia Shmua, right? We have a Masorah, we have a tradition that this is what they did. Where does he get this from? And the Ramban, commenting on this, who thinks this is a formal mitzvah, says we were commanded that when we lay siege on a city to leave one direction open. And there are two rationales he gives for this. Rationale number one is to act with compassion even toward our enemies at the time of war, what you might call a humanitarian rationale. And rationale number two is it's strategic. It also has an advantage because let's think about it. If you're laying siege onto a city and people have nowhere to run to, then what are they going to do? Fight to the very bitter end. But if you give them another option, which says, let people flee, then they might say, okay, well, I'd rather not die in siege right now in war. I'm going to run. And so there's a strategic logic to this as well. But the question, of course, comes is, where does this notion come from? I mean, where do we get this from? So the Meshech Chochmah of Simcha Cohen of Dvinsk says that we learn this idea from what we saw beforehand. When you offer peace, the idea was to try to minimize the casualties, and that is the true as well about this idea of keeping the fourth side open. But I submit to you, friends, that Rabbi Natan, who lives in I can't prove what I'm about to say to you, but Rabbi Natan, who lives in the 2nd century CE, who comes to Eretz Yisrael from Bavel in the times of the Bar Kokhba rebellion, who knew very well the history of Jews suffering, the first Bayit, the second Bayit, second temple, and in Beitar, and sees what sieges do to people and how horrific it is it possible that someone suggested, precisely in the era when Jews have so little power and no power at all, represents in the 2nd century CE. It is the worst political situation in many ways. And he suggests when you fight war, leave a side open in order to make sure that we have compassion even toward our enemies, because our enemies had no compassion to us. And so now we come back to the story that we started with, the debate between Rabbi Goren and Rabbi Israeli. Rabbi Goren says, how often were Jews laying sieges, friends, from the times of the temple until 1982? The answer is, if they're laying sieges, it's because they're in some foreign army, but Jews as Jews weren't laying sieges. But when you come to 1982, Israel lays a siege on Beirut. Rabbi Goren says you gotta leave the side open. Rabbi Israeli says, are you crazy? We don't do that. This is a Mechem mitzvah. This is right. And I can't see you, but I'll take a vote to yourselves right now. Who do you think the IDF followed? Rabbi Goren or Rabbi Israeli? Now, they weren't actually taking advice from the rabbis, right? They didn't work that way. But if you ask yourselves, who did Israel, the state, follow? Did they leave open the fourth side, like Rabbi Goren says, or did they lay a full hermetic siege? The answer is the IDF follows Rabbi Goren and leaves open the fourth side and leaves open the evacuation corridor around this siege around Beirut, so that way people could flee the city. And this is remarkable. And I want to show you now some of the stats that happened from this war. So if you look in the top right here, you'll see that because Israel leaves open evacuation corridor, it's believed to be about 100,000 people fled the city. And so at the end of the war, of Beirut lasted about 2 months. Ultimately, the Reagan administration negotiates some form of ceasefire and sort of imposes a ceasefire in some ways. And Arafat and 14,000 of his terrorists leave Beirut. And then the question became, right, well, what happened in those 2 months? Now, what can I tell you, friends? Nothing is new. So originally, the Lebanese Red Cross was talking about tens of thousands of non-combatant casualties. The Lebanese Red Cross was led by none other than Yasser Arafat's brother. So the reliability of his reports weren't exactly seen as being the most bona fide. But we have a work that's been done by Richard Gabriel and by Trevor Dupai and Paul Martel, who are Americans, who are sort of outsiders in some ways. And the estimate is that 1,000 PLO fighters and 88 Israeli soldiers died during the siege. But here's the key point. About 5,000 non-combatants were killed, another 20 to 30,000 wounded. Okay, now that's obviously extensive, right? I mean, that's a lot of people. But keep in mind, you have 2 months of urban warfare in a tightly crowded city. Right? Those numbers on the one hand are tragic, but relatively speaking, look at the top number. Because Israel kept open the evacuation corridor, a lot of people left the city and survived. And here are some interesting comments that are made about the Israeli war and bombardment of Beirut. The first on the top left comes from Louise Doswell Beck, who was a lawyer for the International Red Cross, which is not usually so complimentary to Israel, to put it mildly, right, over the past 40 years. And she wrote the following: the Israeli bombardment of Beirut in June and July of 1982 resulted in high civilian casualties, but not necessarily excessively so, given the fact that the military targets were placed amongst the civilian population. In other words, the PLO is fighting with human shields. They're fighting behind the civilian population. And given what happened in this circumstance, it's extensive, but not excessive, right? The number of casualties. And you have 2 non-Jewish military historians from America, Trevor Dupai and Paul Martel, who wrote a book called Flawed Victory. I think it's the best book on the First Lebanon War. And they write, as military historians, we can think of no war in which greater military advantages were gained in combat in densely populated areas at such a small cost in civilian lives lost and property damaged. And this despite the PLO's deliberate emplacement of weapons in civilian communities. And Rav Goren cites this idea and cites this phenomenon and says this is a massive Kiddush Hashem. Now, you can say, yes, of course, it's true. A lot of people died. That's definitely tragic. That's horrible, right? But relative to what's going on in war, the history of war, look at the statement of Dupai and Martel, and it's a pretty remarkable phenomenon. But here, friends, things get a little bit more complicated, because in 1982, Israel lets out, makes this negotiation. Arafat and his men, 14,000 men, are supposed to leave. But by 1983, they're back again in Lebanon. They come back around, and Israel is fighting in Tripoli. Tripoli is the city in Lebanon I'm referring to, not the one in Libya. And they're fighting, and they're laying a siege to Tripoli. And Rabbi Goren is still the chief rabbi, and there's talk about leaving a side open and evacuation corridor to let people flee. And Rabbi Goren says it is absolutely usher, forbidden, to let anyone flee from Tripoli. And everyone looks at him and says, wait a minute, what happened? And in fact, if you look at his writing from 83, it sounds like he's more or less copying and pasting the argument of Rabbi Israeli from the year beforehand. Now, he has a response to this, Rabbi Goren, in which he says, listen, in 82, Israel was surrounding all four sides. In 83, one of the sides is actually being held by Arab opponents to the PLO, meaning people that were adversaries of the PLO. And therefore, he says, we don't have responsibility because we don't have control over all sides. But if you think that the whole rule is for humanitarian purposes, well, what's the difference? You should let people out. And I think what happened with Rabbi Goren is he got a little bit stuck. Is this a bona fide rule? He says this is a bona fide law of Rabbi Natan. But you might say that it's not meant to be a bona fide rule, the fourth side open, as much as it's meant to give a principle. And the principle was saying, do what you can to let people out of the area of war. Do what you can to minimize civilian casualties. But because we're balancing different values, and in terms of trying to win the war and to kill the evil, you're going to have to figure out how to balance those values in complex situations. And I think that's what's represented by the fourth side. I think it's a powerful statement, which of Rabbi Natan, which tells us that when you're fighting a war, do what you can to have mercy toward the enemy side, as strategic value as well. This is part of our Masorah, but you're always going to be balancing that value against other values as well. And so I think this is a really fascinating moment, because we have here in practice, in the case of the IDF, this idea which tries to establish you want to win the war, you want to uproot your enemies, and you want to try to minimize the harm to others, particularly those who aren't fighting against you. Because as Moshe says, these are the people that haven't sinned against us. Right? Why do we want to kill them? That's not our value. And so this is precisely the difficulty of warfare. It's precisely having these values at play and trying to balance how you manifest them. And I think that, it's hard to know exactly what's going on right now. The information is a little bit murky, but based on precedent and based on what Israel's been declaring, what they're trying to do, and I think what they've done in the past, is to try to balance these values in different ways. And to a great extent, as we saw in the comments about the war in Beirut, Israel has achieved that to a large extent. And in that respect, I think it's a great Kiddush Hashem. But doesn't mean that there isn't going to be extensive death. And there's going to be extensive death. That is part of the nature of warfare. And that's part of the nature, particularly of urban warfare and asymmetric warfare, when you're fighting in civilian areas. And so what my hope and prayer is, and I'll turn to questions and comments, is that we are able to learn from the history, from our history of experiencing the horrors of sieges, from also understanding the horrific, or how horrific it is when we don't have power and how we suffered, and to understand that we need to balance these values at play when we try to fight an ethical war that takes into account all of these values. And it's my hope and prayer that the IDF and the Israeli government will successfully do this in its efforts to achieve security for all of us here in Israel. Rabbi, I'll turn it over to questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Rabbi. So if anyone has any questions, you could use the raise your hand emoji or put it in the chat, or just unmute yourself and we'll try to avoid chaos. So does anyone have a question or a comment? And it could be on this or on other aspects of the conflict, as Rabbi Brody mentioned.
So I'll mention, by the way, while if we're waiting for a comment, one of the issues that comes up is about the issue of forewarning. This is a big idea in contemporary military ethics. They should try to forewarn and let people know that to flee. I think people ask, well, is this like a Jewish principle or not? I think the fourth side open might indicate that as well, right? There's an idea of saying this principle, we want to get people out of the area. There's strategic value to it. There's also humanitarian value to it. And in this respect, Israel can pay a price, right, when it lets people know, right? We're coming to northern Gaza. When you tell people that, right, you are in many ways taking away from a certain type of military advantage, but there might be advantage to that as well. I think this sort of comes from here also.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so questions or comments? Don't be shy. Oh, go ahead, Rabbi.
Good evening or good morning to you. Is there any record of any?
You're muted.
Wait, you got muted.
You're remuted.
Sorry. Okay. Is there any record of any other military, any other army also following strategically or for any other reason, letting people go? Is it part of the Geneva Convention? Are there rules in effect that really ask armies to behave in this way? You know, I think Yitzhak Greenberg once said that the Israeli army can afford to fight 5% more morally than its enemies. 8% more, 10% more, they lose. Are there other armies that behave this?
Okay, that's a great question. And there are a couple of parts to that question. So when it comes to the fourth side open, on this Sifri, which comes from the 2nd century, Rabbi Shaul Lieberman, in his commentary to the Tosefta, Sefka Pshuta, says that he thinks there's some parallels in Roman military strategy to it. And I researched this a little bit. And most Roman strategists of the time period said that you lay a siege and you try to kill people, right? Sieges are not so easy, by the way, to do because you have to have time. You can sit outside there. You have to have men, right? You can sit and hold up the siege against. So sieges don't always work. And therefore, there is a strategy, which is offered by a couple of Roman military strategists in the 1st century, which says, well, why wait around to conquer a city if you can get them to flee? So give them the side open to let them flee. So you do see this notion a little bit out there. It's possible Rabbi Natan got that idea from sort of what's going on being discussed in the Roman era. Not clear to me how he knows about it, right? There's always these questions. You always wonder. But the idea in those writings is much more about strategy than it is about humanitarianism, right? This is basically saying this is a much faster way of conquering a city if you let people out, so that way the city gets evacuated. So that that is an interesting parallel. In terms of contemporary ideas of war, so I think that the contemporary notions of war, notions of military ethics, starting in what was known as the Lieber Code, which was a code that Abraham Lincoln asked to be written in the middle of the Civil War in 1861, tries to emphasize this idea that the value is to avoid killing non-combatants. That is like the #1 principle that we try to execute within war. Execute's not the right term here, right? But in order to implement in war of sort of military ethics is along these lines. Now, what is the problem, and this is what you relate to the second quote from Rabbi Greenberg, which I wasn't familiar with. I'd be happy to find that reference if you know where he wrote that or said that. And that is that, it's really hard to fight war ethically when the other side doesn't want to play by any rules. Right? In general, rules, the whole notions of military rules, of military ethics are based on reciprocity. Everyone should be fighting along, and that's how you minimize civilian casualties. And one of those basic rules, for example, is don't target civilians, don't target non-combatants, and get your own non-combatants out of the battle zone. And so one of the struggles that we have here is a situation where in asymmetric warfare with terrorist groups, they have no interest in doing that. That was actually the topic of why I wrote this article in Sapir, Rabbi Gelman, that you referenced earlier on, where I try to speak about this idea that even when the other side doesn't play by any rules, we still have our own reasons to try to play by these rules and to minimize civilian non-combatant casualties. And so in this respect, I think it's important, but Rabbi Greenberg's insight is a good one. Rav Kook actually says something similar to this as well, which is that if you want to explain how Jews fought in antiquity, you have to understand when you have to fight according to the rules of the game of the time period. And it's really hard to do that when the other side doesn't want to fight by any rules if you want to try to minimize those casualties. So I think that's part of the struggle we have here today. That's why I find it so infuriating, actually, when I hear like the Canadian Prime Minister, saying it's so terrible about, it is terrible that there's, non-combatant casualties, women and children are dying in Gaza and whatnot. But there's only limitations of what you can do in the context of a war where the other side doesn't play by any rules. But I do think there's great, great value, and there's no need for Israel. I think Israel's sticking to this, to only target combatants. Should only be targeting combatants. And that's a really important principle, which I think we see from these sources. And I think the Fourth Side Open is one of the great sources of this notion. So thank you for the question. You're muted.
I posted Rabbi Brody's article, How Israel Can Respond Ethically to Hamas, in the chat. So before you leave, if you click on that, you'll be able to read it. It's a good journal in general. They're actually publishing right now sort of an ongoing diary from an Israeli soldier, which is quite moving. Okay, any other comments or questions? Okay. Well, in that case, we will say Laila Tov to those of us here in Denver, and Boker Tov to you, Rabbi Brody. I don't know if you're going back to sleep or going to Shacharis.
I got 5 kids. I ain't going back to sleep anytime soon.
Okay. Thank you so much for getting up very early in the morning to learn with us and to teach us. And hopefully next time we talk about this, it'll be more theoretical.
Indeed. Yes. Please God, we'll see the end of war soon, and hopefully victory along with it as well, and safety. So thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, TDK, for joining. Don't forget, next Tuesday, it's at 6 o'clock, because our speaker is in Eastern time, and so the time differences make it a little complicated. At 6 o'clock, Matt Levitt, highly worthwhile. He's a real expert on the inside of what makes Hamas and Hezbollah tick. So hopefully you'll be able to join that. Thank you again. Have a good night, everybody. Thank you, Rabbi Brody.
Thank you, Rabbi Gelman.